Ms. Vitter, do you believe that Brown versus Board of Education was correctly decided?
Senator, I don't mean to be coy, but I think I get into a difficult area when I start commenting on Supreme Court decisions which are correctly decided and which I may disagree with. It is binding. If I were honored to be confirmed, I would be bound by it, and of course I would uphold it.
Do you believe it was correctly decided?
And again, I will respectfully not comment on what could be my boss's ruling, the Supreme Court. I would be bound by it. And if I start commenting on I agree with this case or don't agree with this case, I think we get into a slippery slope.
Donald Trump's appointee to a federal appeals court, Wendy Vitter, saying one reasonable thing there and one horrendous thing at her confirmation hearing. It's reasonable for judges to be careful when commenting on Supreme Court decisions, since they're supposed to keep opinions quiet and follow the law in office. It's also concerning if a judge cannot find a way to speak to the propriety and logic and rightness of the foundational principle that our schools should not be racially segregated. She was also pressed on her past work promoting this brochure, which claims birth control pills can kill women. Now, the issue with Brown v. Board is arising with many Trump nominees.
Do you believe that Brown versus Board of Education was correctly decided?
Senator, of course, Brown versus the Board of Education corrected an egregious error in overruling Plessy versus Ferguson and the separate but equal doctrine. And if I...
Is that a yes?
Well, Senator, if I appear...
Yes or no? Do you think it was correctly decided?
Senator, if I appeared before you as a private citizen, unbound by the canons of conduct that apply to United States judges, I could give you a yes or no answer. But because I'm a judicial nominee, I'm not allowed to comment on the merits of Supreme Court.
So you think it may have been incorrectly decided?
Senator, even the most universally accepted Supreme Court case is outside the bounds of a federal judge to comment on. That's not
Neil Gorsuch sat before this committee, and when I asked him this same question, he said yes. Are you saying that Neil Gorsuch violated some ethics rule by saying that Brown versus Board of Education was correctly decided?
Not at all, Senator Blumenthal.
Not at all. Now, another Trump judicial nominee was criticized this week for past writings that attacked political correctness. Okay, well, is that so bad? But they also claim that politically correct efforts to advance tolerance are more damaging than Nazi book burnings. Here's the quote getting attention. I've often marveled at the odd strategies that some of the more strident racial factions of the student body employ in their attempts to heighten consciousness and promote diversity and convince us that to partake of that fruit which promises to open our eyes to a PC version of the knowledge of good and evil. Still quoting, quote, I'm mystified because these tactics seem always to contribute to more restricting consciousness, aggravating intolerance, and pigeonholing cultural identities more than many a Nazi book burning, end quote. Now, a lot of people use turns of phrase they regret, but this is not just a debate about word choice. This is the stricter question of whether this person has the judgment to get a lifetime appointment to the federal bench to decide other people's freedom. And the wider issue tonight is Trump's judicial nominations are actually one of these areas where even while his legislative record may be thin and these nuclear negotiations are TBD, the nomination work grinds on, powered largely by conservatives in the Trump administration who can pick names without a lot of, shall we say, hands-on presidenting from the president. And I can tell you tonight there are 148 vacancies on the federal bench in America. Republican political groups very clear about their agenda for these spots. They want nominees that are conservative, loyal, and young. And some are eyeing a new vacancy that could even tip the Supreme Court before 2020. This is what Senator Grassley said today, quote, my message to any one of the 9 Supreme Court justices, if you're thinking about quitting this year, do it yesterday. Meanwhile, the GOP is breaking rules that Democrats used to follow in the Senate. They're ending the practice that allows senators to veto home state nominees, which was once a local courtesy. So while Donald Trump talks up North Korea and the Mueller probe continues to put heat on all kinds of Trump associates, the consequences of this battle will, by definition, outlive the Trump era. Mitch McConnell knows that. We checked the numbers, and he's teed up over a dozen judicial nominations for Senate votes. Now, Donald Trump may not lift a finger in this fight, and I mean that literally. He's never used his Twitter fingers to tweet about these appeals court nominees. In fact, since the election, he's only tweeted twice about votes on nominees for the executive branch. This doesn't seem to be a fight that interests him personally. But as Rachel says, watch what they do. Because the Trump administration, thanks clearly to the staffing, today put forward 10 more of these judicial nominees. Can the administration keep up this pace? How much more of this kind of court pressure are we going to see? Well, tonight we have the perfect person to ask about this next. Stay with us. Just tonight, the Democrats on the Senate Judiciary Committee put out this report. They call it a review of Republican efforts to stack the federal courts. It's signed by every single Democrat on the committee. And they state President Trump and Senate Republicans have prioritized filling the nation's federal courts, particularly circuit courts, with ideological judges intent on weakening civil rights, women's rights, workers' rights, and the ability of everyday Americans to hold corporations accountable. They continue that alleging that the Senate Republicans have placed 2 circuit nominees on scheduled hearings before nominees were even evaluated by the ABA, and ignored the ABA's not qualified ratings, neglecting to follow up when nominees did not disclose information required. And Democrats on the committee are sounding the alarm on this rush of judicial nominees, which Republicans want to force through for Donald Trump. And the Democrats say they are seeing ideological nominees that are weakening civil rights, that may not even be qualified under what is, of course, the nonpartisan standard from the ABA. Republicans, they say, also undermining the entire vetting process. We turn to an expert on these issues who has been sounding the alarm. Sharon Eiffel is president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, which calls tonight's report sobering. This is one of those things that's so important, it will outlast the life of this administration.
And you and me.
And us. That's a humble thought about our humanity. And yet doesn't get a ton of attention. Why are you shining a light on it?
Well, I've been sounding the alarm on this for some time because, frankly, in many ways, this is the most important legacy of this president, or of any president, is the way in which they shape the federal bench. When President Obama was in office, the Republicans, slow-walked many of his nominees, and as a result, when President Trump came into office, he had 112 vacancies on the federal bench that he could fill. That was twice the amount that President Obama had when he first took office. And so he had a whole lot of positions to fill. But that wasn't good enough for the Republicans, particularly on the Senate Judiciary Committee. They want to push these nominees through as fast as possible. And the result is that we've seen categories of nominees that, frankly, I have not seen in my career, as long as I've been looking at this work. Nominees that are patently incompetent. We can all remember Max Peterson, the nominee who had never tried a case and seemed never to have seen the inside, of a courthouse. We remember Brett Talley, who ultimately had to withdraw after it was revealed that he had written over 1,800 blog posts, some in which he had praised the first Ku Klux Klan. This is all information that we found out not because the nominees disclosed that information on their Senate questionnaires. We found out because groups like the Legal Defense Fund and Alliance for Justice probed and looked in the record and found this information. And that's why the pushing through of these nominees so quickly is so really devastating, because we're only discovering what we need to learn about these nominees when we really pushed. When we see these nominees answering questions in which they're not able to say that Brown versus Board of Education was correctly decided. You had this up in the earlier segment. This is important information that we have to probe, and yet Senator Mitch McConnell, is determined to push these nominees through as soon as possible, to the point today that he did something that is virtually unprecedented, been done very rarely in the past, and that is bring a nominee to a vote even though one of his home state senators has not returned the blue slip, and that's Michael Brennan for the 7th Circuit.
Right, and that again goes to the real intensity behind which Republicans are pushing this, even if it's one of these things that Donald Trump isn't all that clued in on. You mentioned Brown. Let me read from Dahlia Lithwick, who talks about these nominees that struggled, which as we just showed, and she asked, are Vitter and Oldham suggesting they can't discuss Brown because they believe it's conceivable that a case questioning its prohibition on racial segregation could come up before them now? What case would that be? If the nominees refuse to give their views about Brown, will they also refuse to talk Dred Scott, which of course refuted the humanity of black Americans? What about the internment of the Japanese? Why is Brown a sticking point for them? And I ask this fairly, not in a baiting way. Is this as bad as it looks? Or is it possible that they've been very poorly coached and they just think if they answer one case, they'll get 10 more?
No, I don't think so. I've heard that, and you explained why in the quote from Dahlia Lithwick. Judges who are nominated to sit on the Supreme Court, for example, know that perhaps Roe versus Wade might come before them again.
Sure.
It would be news to me as a practicing civil rights lawyer that Brown versus Board of Education is likely to come before the Supreme Court anytime soon. It is part of the canon that constitutes kind of the center of our justice system.
Right.
No one questions whether Marbury versus Madison was correctly decided. And people readily talk about, some of the terrible decisions, Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, Korematsu.
So do you see it as some sort of judicial dog whistle?
I do think so. I do think it's actually a signal. I mean, you'll recall when Neil Gorsuch was asked the question, he tried a couple of times to avoid it. He didn't want to answer the question, but then he finally came across and answered the question. There are other very conservative justices who've answered this question. Justice Scalia answered that it was correctly decided, for example. So it's not a question of whether you're conservative or not. It's not a question of whether it's going to lead you down the primrose path of answering questions about cases that might come before the court. Brown is part of the central canon. It now essentially reflects your belief in the rule of law. It ended legal apartheid in this country. And the idea that a judge or who wants to be elevated to a seat on the federal bench somehow can't bring themselves to say that this central case to American democracy was correctly decided is deliberate. And we saw that once, Wendy Vitter did it, then the next week, Andrew Oldham did it. It's now catching on. And I think we're likely to see more judges saying it. It's now becoming something that can be said. And this is where the lines are moving, Ari, and this is what's so important. The public watching it should not believe that this is normal. This is deeply abnormal. This is deeply far outside what we have seen, even with the most conservative judges who've come before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And that's why it's important for people to call their senators and tell them, I want you to do your job. I want you to fully vet these nominees. I want you to read the questionnaire. I want you to know before they sit at that table whether they've ever tried a case.
Right.
And I want to know whether they stand for the principles of equality and justice that are enshrined within Brown versus Board of Education.
Sherilyn Ifill, thank you for your work on this and educating this, on this issue, which is so important. NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I really appreciate it.